Many of you know that not too long ago, I started a weekly teacher's class where podcast listeners like yourself join me once a week for a live video call. Sometimes we just carry on conversations that get started here on the podcast, but very often these days, it's become this incredible resource where we share information and we talk about different things that are happening in our classes and how we can better ourselves as teachers. And it's really become quite a fantastic thing that I love doing each week. And there's a lot of folks who subscribe who can't make it to the live call and just watch it on the replay, which is kind of just like having another awesome podcast episode to watch or listen to every week. But not so long ago, I was traveling and we did it at this off time where all these folks in different time zones also got to join in on the live call. And we've also gotten lots of emails from people who want to join in, but the weekly time just didn't fit into their schedule or they're in another time zone. So we figured out a way to make it more possible for more people. If you enjoy the podcast and you want to have an opportunity to listen to other teachers, to have your ideas heard, and to just share in some of these conversations, this is really the perfect place to do it. And now, no matter where you are in the world, there will be an opportunity for you. Please join us. It's the J. Brown Yoga Weekly Teachers Class. You can find it at jbrownyoga.com. All right, you did it. You hit play. And now we're on. This is J. Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is J. Brown. How are you? How is this day treating you so far? Well, I hope. First things first, we've had a last-minute programming change. If you didn't notice, some of you are wondering, hey, I thought we were going to talk to the new Ashtanga organization this week. That's what you told us last week. Well, like 2 days ago, they had like this major crash of their website, some big problem with their website. So their website is down. It just seemed like a shame to put out the episode with no place for people to go find out more info. So we've pushed it a week and we shuffled things. And so today, I'm going to share with you this talk that I had with Jude Boccio. And some of you just heard that name and your ears peaked up because you know who Frank is and you're like, oh my God, that's going to be amazing. And then there's probably a bunch of other folks out there who are like, who's Jude Boccio? Well, you're going to find out. Frank had an impact on me, even though we never met. We talk all about it. And he's someone who represents certain things that are very important to me. So we had an excellent talk, and I'm excited for you to hear it today. We will hear the talk with the folks from Amayu Ashtanga next week. But before we get to today's talk with Frank, I want to get very real with you. Because earlier this week, I had a conversation with the teachers in my weekly teachers class. I recorded a talk with Norman Blair that you're going to get to hear in a few weeks. And I've been listening to several podcasts, and it's really all been kind of culminating in some ideas that I have in my mind about transparency and money and knowing where we really stand. We're right at this time of the year where, I got to get my tax returns in, right? We got to get it in the next month or so. We got to get it together, right? So I want to start a trend. I want to share with you how much money I made. And that's a crazy thing to do. We're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to put forward this kind of like perfect picture, this picture of success. And we hold our cards close to our chest when it comes to our spreadsheets. But I've just been realizing that part of the reason why I think people feel exploited, and we're wondering, like, are the yoga centers, making all this money off the yoga teachers? And like, where's all the money in the yoga industry going? Because it doesn't seem like yoga teachers can really make a living these days. And part of it is just because nobody knows how much anyone is making. And there's never like a place or a reason why we would share that, because it runs counter to like the mores of our economics and our society. So I want to break it. And maybe this is like the stupidest thing I've ever done in the world. I don't know. But I just did like a quick rundown of numbers before I went to record this. And this isn't like the final number. Like there's still some deductions that haven't been made yet. But a rough number for what I made in 2018 is just over $75,000. Just under half of that was in online video and podcast sponsorship, and just over half of that was in in-person teaching. And I'm just wondering, like, are there other yoga teachers listening to this right now who are making six figures or doing better than that? I know there's a lot of yoga teachers who are not even doing that well. I mean, I managed to pay all my bills this year, and it was a huge, uncertain period of time. I had the yoga center for a lot of years, so I didn't even really know if I was going to be able to make enough money to do that. Granted, I got a whole shitload of debt that I haven't gotten anywhere near tackling, but at least I like held my own. So I consider it a very successful year. I made my living this year as a yoga teacher, and I just don't know that there's a lot of people out there doing that. And I'm wondering about the people who are managing to do it. And I'm really wondering, like, who's doing better? Like, who is it that's making six figures or more? My bet is that if you're making six figures or more, that means you're doing teacher training. I was talking with Josh, my producer, the other day in a meeting, and he said a thing that is kind of horribly true. He, in sort of like this cynical moment of rant, said, the yoga industry has been reduced to leggings and yoga teacher training. That's the only thing that's making money in the yoga industry right now. Leggings and yoga teacher training. And there's something true about that, I think. If you're doing, anywhere from 2 to 5, like 200-hour trainings in a year, I guess some people do that many, then you could probably be, making more than six figures. But I didn't do any teacher training in 2018 at all. And I'm just wondering, like, do you have to do teacher training in order to make a living as a yoga teacher? And if so, we got big problems, you guys, because this whole 200 hours for $3,000 or whatever the fuck we're doing, it's a problem. So that can't be the way that we make the living. Like, that's not sustainable. That's not a sustainable business model. Already those numbers are slowing, and most people are seeing it. There's like a few people who are still commanding like some big teacher training numbers, but I know there's a lot of yoga center owners listening to this right now, and you all know what I'm talking about. And it's a fickle thing. It's a fickle thing to depend on those surges, of people dropping the cash and then, not even really, you guys know. So anyways, I go first. I think we should just tell everybody how much we're making. Let's just all tell each other. I'm probably the only one who's going to do it, but I would really love it if we could just I'm not on social media these days, but I would love if we could just be really transparent. Let's be honest about how much we're making, and maybe we can then be in a position to know where we stand, and then we can make better determinations. We can have better discernment about what we're doing. And if what we're doing is just playing into this gross commodification of everything that's killing our country and the world, or if what we're doing can still be true to principles, as I've been saying. I was listening to my friend Ryan and Kate from Unrolled Podcast Talk. Shout out to them if they're listening. They haven't been putting out a lot of episodes, but they were talking about how if you market something, you automatically, change it. Like something automatically gets sacrificed as soon as we market it. And they were sort of like lamenting that you can't really make a living off of teaching yoga for that reason. And I don't know. I'm going to push back on that, you guys. I think it's possible. I think it's possible for there to be a profession of teaching yoga. Now, I don't think that means that everybody's going to be able to make their full living off of it. I think a lot of people, as it is the case now, are right to have other sources of income, like unrelated sources of income even. I think that's right. I don't think there's going to be like a one thing for everyone. But I think it's possible to make money off what you do as a yoga teacher and still have it really be true to your principles. I feel like I did it pretty much for the most part. Yeah, no, I did it this year. I'm trying to think in my mind, like, was there any moments where I compromised my principles? And I don't believe that I did. And I'm wondering if it's possible not just for me but for others, and it's got to be. But it means letting go of these like conventional ways of thinking and doing things. Like, just because that's how people are doing it in the industry doesn't mean that's how we should do it. And that if we can free ourselves from trying to follow those like market industry precepts, we can potentially create something that we have yet to fully imagine. How about that? All right, that's it. That is my admission and disclosure. And it's very appropriate for today's talk, actually. You'll see Frank is somebody who is also like that. And, he's a very transparent, real deal kind of guy. So it is in the spirit of today's talk. Another thing that Frank and I talk about today is how certain aspects of yoga practice, for lack of better words, let's say the more contemplative aspects of yoga, are sometimes getting sacrificed because they don't sell as well. Like, people want quick fixes and tight bodies more than they want subtle, nuanced inquiries into the nature of their being. Like, people are sometimes more reluctant to pay for things that require work of you. You know what I mean? You pay for something and you want to get something back worth it in return, So the nature of yoga pedagogy, when we're talking about these subtler aspects of practice, it doesn't always sell well. But we also talk about how there's an underswell of people who are interested in these deeper parts of the study. And I'm betting like a bunch of you listening are those people, or you probably wouldn't listen. And I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Yogic Studies. If you were listening a few weeks ago to the conversation I had with Seth Powell, then you got a little bit of a glimpse into Yogic Studies, which is Seth Powell's online educational resource. And I talked about it with him, how I took his course on the history and philosophies of yoga. He also has a course on the sutras and a course on Sanskrit. And one of the things that Seth does really well is he's able to take the study of the history and philosophies of yoga and Sanskrit, and he's able to make it digestible and accessible for people. And I think it opens up all kinds of doorways into deeper inquiry. And I believe it is the kind of offering that raises up the level of education and I think ultimately the benefits of yoga. So I'm excited that he's decided to sponsor us, and we're offering a discount. If you go to yogicstudies.com and use promo code JBrown15, you can get 15% off any of his courses. That's JBrown15 for 15% off. Go to yogicstudies.com. We are also sponsored today by Karmasoft. And longtime listeners know who Karmasoft is, but maybe you're new and you don't know. Karmasoft is a complete online yoga studio management solution. I used Karmasoft when I had my yoga center in Brooklyn. It is by far superior than Mind Body Online, in my opinion. The owner of Karmasoft, Rudy Senecal, he was on the podcast some while back. You can go back and listen to the episode. And I just know that if you or someone you know is having to manage a studio, if you're having to do scheduling of the classes and the online registrations and payrolls, and you're having to do that kind of work, you can definitely make your life easier by using Karmasoft. And you're not going to get jacked around and have your prices hiked up all the time or get upsold on all the shit that you don't need, because Rudy is a very cool guy and you can actually relate to him as a person rather than feeling like you're dealing with like this big corporation. So if you're running a studio, do yourself a favor, get off of the Mind Body Online, go to karmasoftonline.com. Lastly, I got a couple of gigs coming up. If you want to hang out in person, I'm going to be in Portland, Maine, February 23rd and 24th, and I'm going to be in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, March 16th, back in the hood. I'm going to do a workshop in the afternoon and a live podcast event in the evening, and I got a couple of emails. Apparently, there isn't any registration links up yet for that, but it's going to be up there pretty soon. Just hang tight. It's definitely happening. That's March 16th in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, live podcast event. If you're going to be around, come hang out. You can find out about those gigs and more and listen to the archives of this podcast and read my blog and find all of my online yoga video offerings. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I'm going to check in with you on the other side and just go over a few things, as I sometimes like to do. But for now, I think that's it. Let's go ahead and listen to this talk that I had with Frank Jude Boccio.
Hello.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you, Frank?
Very punctual. It's very cool.
Well, you know, especially when you're scheduling something like this, although it's very interesting to see who appreciates that amount of punctuality and who feel a little bit oppressed by it.
It's kind of funny because that just came up yesterday in a talk with some yoga teachers because, I think it's been one of my pet peeves with people who run over. And I believe that often they might feel they're being very generous and everything else, but it's like, for me, maybe it's my Zen training, but that's stealing time, and so we had this whole big conversation just yesterday about that. Yeah.
I'm of a similar view. I'm of the view that if I say I'm going to be somewhere at a certain time, then I want to be there at that time. And my least favorite thing ever is the feeling of being late.
Yeah.
And I would say also, though, to your point about yoga teachers, I think it is one of your primary jobs is to just show up on time.
And end on time.
That's true. The ending on time, I guess also that goes to some other things in terms of how classes have gotten shorter over the years. And it depends on the studios and like how tightly they schedule it. But I'm with you, especially because people in class probably have places they have to get to.
That's what I mean by if you're going to talk about asteya, and in Zen, Dogen used this term called uji, which means being time. And basically, we are time. It's not like we have time, we're short of time and everything else. We are time, right? Being time. And so you're literally taking someone's life when you do that. And in the Zen training, if meditation started at 5 a.m, you were on your zafu at 4:55 because it starts at 5. You don't just get there at 5.
Right. I appreciate that kind of discipline, but I also remember like a yoga teacher of mine who would like lock the door right at the time we were supposed to start. And then like people would get there a minute late knocking on the door and she wouldn't let them in. And I always thought, oh, really? Like that person, like, I don't know. I also want us to be a little bit forgiving too.
Yeah.
But no, to your first initial point, I am in agreement. I think, being done on time. I trained myself just like years in Brooklyn, like people on tight schedules. And just like you said, I felt like that's what they signed up for, that amount of time. And while some people didn't mind, some people had places to get to. So it was an act of consideration and of discipline. That's the point you're making, I think.
Yeah. Cool. Are you still in Brooklyn, Jay?
No, actually, I moved from Brooklyn about 18 months ago. Wow. I sold the center I had there for 10 years in Williamsburg and moved to Pennsylvania about an hour and 45 minutes away with my family.
Oh, nice.
It was a good move. I'm glad I did it. But it's interesting that you asked me that question, and I tell you that because it does relate to why I wanted to talk to you. So we've never met before. I mean, we got like a bunch of mutual friends. But it's one of those situations where, and I've had this happen to me as a teacher, but where someone, like you were a teacher to me without ever knowing that you were a teacher to me. And now a lot of times our teachers come to us like through books and stuff that they've put out. And that was the case. Like your book, Mindfulness Yoga, came to me at a very specific inflection point. And it confirmed some really important things to me. And you wouldn't know that. So for me, it's really cool to get a chance to talk because you're just like a name who's always been in my head, and that book is still on my shelf.
Well, that's cool to hear. It's funny though, because like, I think like I knew about you when I was still teaching at the Energy Center way back. And there was a student who I think took classes with you and took classes with me, and she was instrumental in getting that book written even.
Huh. Well, you know what it really was is I, at a certain point in time, really felt a need to become more educated about yoga. And it was before the internet had really started. Actually, it might have been maybe around 1998. And it was right in that initial like internet startup boom. And a friend of mine was starting this like internet startup, and it was going to be a holistic hub portal. And I got hired to be the yoga guy. And my job, there was no Google yet. So my job was essentially to like be a human Google. And I used Alta Vista search engine to try to find yoga websites. And I was able to find about 50 of them that actually had some information on there. And one of them was the Yoga Research and Education Center of Georg Feuerstein.
Yeah.
It was one of the it was a really early website that had loads of information. And one of the things on there was this article he had written called Archaic Yoga. And it was
Yeah.
Do you know that? Do you remember that piece?
Yeah.
And it was huge because it was all about the yoga before Patanjali and about how like what we can gather from the Vedic hymns is not the same as the dualistic thing of Patanjali. And that was hugely important for me. I never heard that before. And there wasn't other resources. I was like trying to go to the library to find other information, and I couldn't find stuff. There was nobody talking about that really. And then I jump forward, we'll go back, but jump forward to maybe around 2004. I'm at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, because I used to do a week every summer as the core faculty instructor. And I got a discount for the bookshop or the shop there. And your book was in there. And that's where I saw it. And like, Georg had written the foreword. And then like the opening part of that book, you're just basically talking about all this stuff. Like you start like the preface of the book before you even get to the other stuff is all the stuff that I wanted to hear about. So I'm just telling you all that to give you some background for my own like personal relationship to you, even though we've never met. And then I will also add to it to finish, and then I will stop talking, hopefully, is that sometime in there is really when like the yoga industry kind of exploded. And there came this big, that was like when all the conference circuit happened. And there was like this kind of new yoga celebrity. But you, as far as I can tell, didn't go that route. And I'm kind of curious about that. And you represent the old school for me. And I want to talk about that today. So all of that is to say thank you for just kind of being a person out there and the inquiry that you were putting out at that time, because it really served and helped me in what I've come to do as well.
It's cool. Yeah, it's funny because that is actually a very conscious decision I made, because I was invited to, like, I did one yoga journal conference, and that was it for me. I was like, it was clear. And it was funny because it was an echo for me. I had a film in the Berlin Film Festival in 1987, and until that point, I was sure my future lay in filmmaking. And I was just so turned off by the marketplace. I still love film and everything else, but it was something I didn't want to do. And then, almost 15 years later or so, I had that same kind of gut reaction when I was at one of the Yoga Journal conferences, and I just was like not wanting that. Plus, I didn't want to be living out of a suitcase.
Well, that's very interesting. And I want to go back because you pointed to this time when you made this film, and I read about that in your bio, and I read like you had started some kind of practices, or like you said that in your bio, like you had some very early childhood experiences that led to this inquiry. And then you spent a period of time where you were like in New York making films and writing about music. And when I found your book, I was living in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Like I spent 10 years in the Lower East Side of Manhattan playing in an avant-garde punk band of sorts.
Oh, cool.
And then I was going to do that gig in Omega. So like there's a parallel for me that you had this period. So maybe go back to like when did you first get to some practice, or when did you first start to like get into yoga or Buddhism?
Well, I started reading books about the Buddha and Buddhism in, the year I turned 16. My older half-sister died, and I just, I guess I was in junior year of high school, and started reading all these books, philosophy, and reading books about Buddhism. But I really didn't, it was all intellectual. I was just reading and getting some nourishment from, reading about that. But I was also reading the Stoics and stuff. But it was 1976 when my first marriage started to implode. And I was working, the only straight day job I ever had was for a couple of years back then. I was working for Merrill Lynch on Wall Street.
Wow. And that's back before they had the algorithms and people were like on the floor screaming and yelling, right?
Oh, well, not just that. I was working the computer operations, and then we had a whole floor in Greenwich Village, and it was still, putting tapes on the machines, and it was pretty wild, but it was really like deadening. And someone suggested that I take a yoga class, and so I'll never forget my first yoga class and that first shavasana, and just really having intimations of some of the experiences I had when I was younger, which I hadn't had in several years. And it just really blew me away. But what was happening is that the only time I actually felt good in my life was while taking a yoga class. And by the time I got off this train, and I was living at the time in Flushing, Queens, I was back into misery. And it was just at that point I read an early sutta where the Buddha was describing his experience with his teachers who were teaching Samkhya. And he said when he was in the state of samadhi or jhana, it was very blissful and wonderful. He says, but then when I get up from my meditation and engage in the world of the senses, soon I am, caught in dukkha. And that, to see that pattern, that the Buddha described a pattern that I was experiencing, I decided now is the time to practice. And it was ironic because at that point I think I was doing yoga for, taking classes for about 6 months. And
what were those classes like? So we're talking about 1976 New York or Queens,
yeah.
You said?
Well, I was actually going, my first few classes were at the World Yoga Center on, I think it was West 72nd Street off Broadway in a brownstone. And then I started going, when I found out that like 3 blocks away from the computer operations was Integral Yoga. So then I started going there. And even, and this is the thing, even then, at what was basically an ashram, there were residential swamis living at Integral Yoga on, I think it was 13th Street or 11th, I forget now. All this talk about we're doing asanas to prepare for meditation, but we never really meditated. The meditation was taught as a separate class or course. So unless you actually did that, which I did, there was still a divide in the actual practice of asana and meditation. So after 6 months and feeling this in my own life and then reading this passage where the Buddha describes that pattern, I finally got to a Buddhist center. And so pretty early on, Buddhism and yoga were integrated in my own practice. The funny thing there, though, is, I didn't know there were all these different forms of Buddhism. And I had been reading books that were primarily about Theravada, which is much more psychological, and Zen, which is much more this worldly based. And then I ended up going to what at the time was called Vajradhartu. It was Trungpa Rinpoche's center. And Tibetan Buddhism has often been referred to as like the Roman Catholicism of Buddhism. And I was like, what is it with all these deities? And I got, I definitely got some instruction in Shamatha Vipassana there. But as soon as they started talking about deity yoga and guru yoga, I was out of there. And I remember still talking to a teacher and saying, this is not the kind of stuff I was reading about. And when I mentioned, the most recent book I had read was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. This is New York back in the 70s. They were like, oh, well, there's a Zendo down the block. It was in Chelsea. And, that set my course for the rest of my life so far.
Wow. Well, I think that's intriguing to me because I, too, at age 16 had death. Like my mom died when I was 16. And so that connects to like where my yoga starts too. And it also connects to something else that what you're describing to me is like, I came, I didn't start practicing until the early 90s, but there was still like the flavor of what you're describing in the sense that I definitely did not get into yoga for fitness. That it was a contemplative practice, like a counterculture move. Like nobody knew what yoga was or thought it. If I was at a party, I always say this, and somebody said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a yoga teacher." They would say, "What's that?"
Well, no one spoke about practice then as a workout.
Yeah, I know, and it definitely, and there was also, it was still deeply, much more ingrained in like the guru traditions, the lineage traditions, and that was how you had credibility. You cited your teacher. Yeah. And I'm intrigued also by this impulse in you from the very beginning, because I think that's what I picked up on in your book, is this kind of, because it came from like this very, primal place in myself to just want to be okay. That initially the conventional thing that I adopted, which is the more common thing, is this kind of classical idea of yoga where I was trying to reach some kind of transcendent consciousness or something, like I'm going to climb this 8 limbs ladder so I can get to the samadhi. And if I get to the samadhi, then I won't have all this grief and pain in me. And at some point that, as you seem to be describing, like that's proved to not be true, proved to be a kind of a trap to me. And I started to find my way to some other ideas, the more non-dual ideas, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that also colors the other thing that you said, because you mentioned you did this film and I read this, you went to like some competition or some festival and you like won. And so there was like this moment where you had like this moment of fame in the film, but then you came up against the industry as you described. So what was the film that you made?
Well, it was, actually, I wrote the story, and the only reason, writers generally don't get invited to film festivals, but the director was actually living in the East Village, I guess undocumented, we might refer to him as. So he figured if he went to Germany, he might not be able to get back to the States. So they sent me and one of the actors, who was Bill Rice, who was kind of an avant-garde figure in the East Village, mostly in theater and art. He was a really wonderful painter. And the two of us were sent to Berlin, and it was really a cool time because it was 87. Wim Wenders was filming Wings of Desire.
Oh, wow.
In Berlin, and it was just like a really great time and getting interviewed. But like back in New York, I was making my living as a taxi driver, and Andy Warhol died while we were at the Berlin Film Festival, and all of a sudden I'm being interviewed about my opinions about the influence of Andy Warhol on film and art and all that. And it occurred to me like the shallowness of celebrity culture, because it was like, I knew no one would even look at me twice back in New York as a cab driver, Mm-hmm. And so it just kind of like, even that celebrity culture thing popped for me. And then, seeing the marketplace was just, it just turned me off, from the that I get from film. And so I realized, all right, I don't want to work in the industry because it will change my relationship to
that thing. See, I had the same experience with acting and theater. Like I won all these acting competitions in high school, and I loved the process of like making that work and kind of like delving into myself. But when it came time to like get headshots and like deal with the industry, it sucked all the magic out of it. And I was like, that's not what I want.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned that you had a relationship go south, and then that is what really catapulted you after this period of this brief glimmer of fame. You also, I read, kind of started studying in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, and I just sort of read somewhere, if I'm right, that he's just like retreated to end his days in reflection. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Well, it's funny because there's two different narratives being reported. I think it was The Atlantic somebody wrote in The Atlantic that he's pretty much, like at the end, and has, I think, given up meds or something. It made it sound like he was in the last days. And then a missive was put out by Plum Village saying that was inaccurate. So who knows the real situation? Obviously, I mean, the photo I saw of him, he definitely is looking at the end, and he's, I think, 92, and he had the stroke, 4 or 5 years ago. So,
well, I read his books. They were important in my development. So did you ever get to meet him in person?
Oh, yeah. I took precepts from him in 95 and then ordained into his order in 97. And for a couple of years before, like now he's got a couple of monasteries. There's one in upstate New York. But before all of that, he had a place in Vermont that never really opened up for public retreats because they couldn't get the, zoning for it. But he would hold retreats for order members. So it was actually a pretty awesome time because it was, I first started practicing with him before his real celebrity caught on. So there might be, it's still a large number, but 200 people on retreat. When we went to Vermont, it would be maybe 50, 60 of us.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com slash premium.